So let's go through tax. First of all, we have federal estate tax. If your estate is over $5,100,000, $5,250,000, I should say, it's good. Goes up by inflation, you got a federal tax problem. Why doesn't everybody stand up who's in that level? Not many, not many. We get some, but at $5,250,000, and for a couple, it's $10,500,000 because they put something in the law called portability. So in our case, if Nancy passes away and we don't use our $5,250,000 credit, her husband, Jake, gets the benefit. So he would have $10.5 million for federal tax purposes. The real issue here in Maryland is state estate tax. If your estate is over $1 million, you're facing a tax of 16%. Now Maryland's pretty generous. The bigger your estate gets, the tax falls to a low of up to 6.4%. So that's where you're looking at your big estate tax issues, unless you don't have close heirs. If you're leaving assets to anybody other than a brother, sister, or a lineal line, lineal I mean, up the line, grandparents and parents, down line, children, grandchildren, it's a 10% tax. So if you're leaving niece and nephew $100,000, that's $10,000. Somebody's got to pay it. So that is the one area that you've got to be concerned about. Now, once we get through all the estate tax issues, we have income tax. And many of you have thrift savings plan and other retirement benefits. Ultimately, they have to be cashed in. And one of our dilemmas, particularly in elder care planning, I had somebody in yesterday where they had $850,000 in retirement plan assets. And they're starting to trend downhill. But they're in a very low income tax bracket. First of all, I recommended that maybe they look, and I do this in conjunction with their accountant, at Roth IRAs so that we can get that down to a lower number. Two, take some of that money out of there at low tax brackets. Because when you pass away, you may be passing a big income tax to your kids, grandkids, and others who are in a very high bracket. Or, worse yet, you need long-term care and we have to cash it all in. And you know what the new tax situation does? If you have a high taxable income, over $400,000 for single people, you're going to pay a whopping big tax. So they're cruising for an economic bruising in this situation. So it's something you do in pre-crisis planning. You start looking at it. Taxes will motivate us. We have to look at these retirement plan assets and plan it out correctly. The beauty with Roth IRAs, you have no income tax. Although it's estate taxable, there's never an income tax situation when they get cashed in. So we get to this point and we say, okay, we've looked at tax, we've looked at long-term. What do we do from a planning perspective? If you are a single person, we just do good estate planning. And your only risk, other than long-term care, which we're going to talk about, your big risk is state estate tax. And your state estate tax, how can you fight it? Well, the only way is to make a gift. We can give up, I've worked, a chunk of money, bring us down below $1 million, and ride off in the sunset, provided we live 3 years. Then we don't have the estate tax. So with a lot of older people, I get older people, I had somebody recently inherited about $600,000. They didn't need it. They were well over $1 million. So we just gave it to the kids. And we did it with a lot of comfort. And we put it in an irrevocable trust for the kids, so they didn't get it too quickly. But we disgorged ourselves of that money. So now, as long as my client lives 3 years, we're going to avoid estate tax that would have probably cost us $60,000, $70,000. Gifting, you can gift away $14,000 a year for the annual gift exclusion. You can gift away an additional $5,250,000. Now, when you make that gift, and it could be any derivation of that, if I make a gift, your name, sir? Jim. If I give Jim a gift of let's say $1 million. I file a gift tax return. There's no issue with you as a recipient. You get it and you ride off to have a good time. I have to pay a tax, but I have an offsetting credit. So it's a non-taxable event, but there is a hidden tax. You get my original cost basis. So if I have a stock portfolio that was worth $500,000, but I gave you $1 million, and you sold it, you have capital gains tax. You just have to remember that. But that may be superfluous. It may be better to gift it. The thing that I want you to understand, particularly for elder care planning, is your ability to gift. Now, as a single person, what you're going to want to do is to do planning for the next generation. I was telling a gentleman earlier, before I spoke, if we're leaving our kids a boatload of money, I shudder to think of leaving a young child a lot of money. But in many cases, I shudder to think leaving a child who's even older a boatload of money. Because think of all the bad things that can happen. What's the first bad thing that you think of? What?
They lose it all.
They lose it all. They're spendthrifts. Another thing, they get divorced and they've commingled their assets. They get sued. How many kids made mistakes and are in foreclosure, short sales, you name it, they've done it. How many of you want your son-in-law or daughter-in-law to inherit your assets? Yeah, it's like, well, if you leave it to your son or daughter and they die prematurely, they leave it to your son-in-law or daughter-in-law who then dies. Guess who gets it? So what we're using in a lot of these cases is a tool called a bloodline trust. I call it a bloodline trust. Others call it a dynasty trust. I hate that word. But I'll take Jim and Nancy. I leave my kids, Jim and Nancy, $500,000 each in trust. They're trustee of their own trust. It is never includable in your estate. You manage your own funds. But if Nancy passed away and had no kids, it would go to Jim. Jim has a child. If Jim passes away, it goes down to his child in trust. Keeps in trust for multiple generations. It's never taxed in your estate. You get divorced, Jim, you don't lose your assets. You go into long-term care, they are not eligible resources, subject to spend down. What else? If one of you passes away, it must stay in your bloodline. And if you made bad investment mistakes, you went through bankruptcy, they can never take your assets. I had a woman who was literally in tears. She came in, her mother had died. Now it's amazing how the tears weren't because mom died. They were because she and her husband, who was a prominent dentist, were going through bankruptcy. And she was scared that the inheritance would be lost to their family bankruptcy. Because in the downturn of the economy, a cosmetic dentist practice went down the tubes. And the net result is her $500,000 of inheritance, luckily, were left in a bloodline trust. So they are in trust for her, and I advise her that the creditors could not make any claim against this inheritance. It was a protective seal that we put around it. Now, it's also a seal that we put around it for somebody who has a gambling problem, for somebody who has a drug, alcoholism, or other problem. One of the other issues, and I gave you a pamphlet on this, about special needs children. I deal with any number of people, whether it's a child or grandchild. If you leave them money, and when I talk about money, over $2,000, they will lose their Medicaid and their Social Security benefits. They'll be pushed out of their group home. It is a nightmare. We get this every year, a couple cases where some well-meaning family member like Lee leaves the money to Johnny over here, Down syndrome child, who's going along well, in a group home, has less than $2,000 and is on Medicaid. And well-meaning Lee has just put us in a precarious position, where now Johnny will be thrown out of the group home, lose Social Security and his Medicaid benefits. Sad. If you have Down syndrome family members or any special needs family member, you've got to communicate in your family. You've got to have a strategy. The strategy is a tool called a special needs trust. Now, you can also craft trusts that leave money to grandkids and kids at various ages. I used to use 25, 30, and 35, but as my kids started growing, it became 30, 35, 40, 45, and 50. I have found this generation of youngsters are staying very immature and very young for a heck of a lot longer. It is amazing how many are still on the family dole in their 30s. I mean, it's mind-boggling. But it just seems like every generation gets worse. And we have to think about who's going to be the fiduciary to oversee it. Because believe me, I've seen it in every family. There's just always one or two that just aren't very capable. And if they're not, you've got to be honest with yourself. Now, some people say, well, you know, I'm going to leave it to Nancy over here and she blows, it's her problem. But you see, I see it differently. Here's how I analyze it. You tell me if you agree. My first concern with my kids is what? What's your first concern? When they were day one? Pardon?
Their health.
Their health. Taking care of their health, that they're clothed, whatever. What's the second thing? Safety. How about education? That was always mine. When my grandchild was born, the first thing I did was fund 529 plans, and I advised my daughter, other than lavishing all these day-to-day gifts that my wife lavishes on this grandchild, we're going to make birthday and other gifts to 529 plans, because I believe in education. And I said, it'll take some burden off of you, Megan, my lovely daughter, and Josh, my son-in-law, for us to start funding that. And advise all the other grandparents in this blended family, of which are 4, so now they get 4 bites of an apple, to do the same thing. But education is important. But once kids are grown, then my next concern was, can they get a house? Do they have enough money for business opportunity? Once we get past that and they're all settled, I have one concern. Do they have enough money to be comfortable in retirement? That's all I care about. No new Ferraris, no new cars. I don't care about trips. Let them earn their way. I sat my kids down when they were young, and I sat with them and I said, I'm giving you 2 things in this world: an education and a work ethic. I'm one of these ones. I remember my son getting angry at me. He said, none of my friends have to work at Eddie's. They're all at the pool and doing things. I said, last time I looked, I wasn't their father. I said, you're going to work, you're going to learn the value of $1 because it will help you later in life. And I had this when I had this conversation. The same thing my dad told me, and I believe it. And I can tell you that as we drop money down to kids and grandkids, we have to be very careful, particularly grandkids, because my granddaughter's 6 months old. I have no clue what she's going to turn out like. I do know my daughter, who's a nurse. I do know what my son is. They're working people. But my granddaughter, who knows? So we've got to be careful in sculpting our documents. Now, if you're married, some of you are happy about it, some not so happy, but if you're married and you pass away, you have the opportunity to save estate taxes. So let's say Jim and Nancy were married, and Jim passes away. I always kill off the male, unless we have a unique situation. It usually happens that way. What we write and use, except in blended families mean 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. I call them the Mickey Rooney syndrome. We get some that have been married 7 times. I congratulate them for the stamina of going through divorces. We've had a couple. And what we do is Jim creates a trust in his will called a disclaimer trust. And it gives Nancy the opportunity to say, I don't want to inherit some of Jim's assets. I want it to go into trust. How much will we put in that trust? Well, if they had $2 million, let's use that as an example. Nancy would say, well, I've got $1 million of my own. I will disclaim Jim's $1 million. Why? It will be exempt from what? Maryland, your first name?
Laura.
Laura, she wins the prize. It's exempt from Maryland state taxes. The beauty about a disclaimer trust is Laura or Nancy can make a decision post-mortem after somebody dies. Because of ever-changing tax laws, we need flexible documents. We can't just say we're going to leave them up to $1 million in trust, because what if the credit changes? What if they did away with state of Maryland tax? Then we would put nothing in trust, because with the new federal portability rules, you get Jim's $5,250,000 federal credit. So federal tax law for most people are not big issues. But then I ask you, Laura, what if they drop the credit in 5 years, as they are suffering for dollars, to $3 million? We need flexible documents. One of the interesting things, I had this client come in and said, well, there's been all these changes. I said, yeah, we're going to update your power of attorney. We're going to make one little change to your estate planning document. They said, well, I said, you have disclaimer trust. It didn't matter. They could have done 25 tax law changes and you're set. That's what you want to use. Now, in certain families, that doesn't work. Yes, sir? Federal. Federal and state. So if I get a larger estate, let's say somebody truly is worth up to 10, 15 million, I use the same tool. The difference is, I still would only put $1 million in trust, because what I would do, if we put $1 million in trust, $4,500,000 would $4,250,000 would go to your spouse, and your spouse would have $9,500,000 in taxable benefit. So it's a little obtuse, because you would only fund for the state of Maryland, not for the federal part. Although I had a case yesterday with a blended family where we wanted to limit what we put in trust, and we specifically said these assets will go in trust for the husband. This was a Cougar estate. And these assets will go to the wife's children. So that they didn't, and they had a prenuptial agreement, by the way. One thing I want to advise you about a prenup, because I had a bad case this last week. Prenuptial agreements do not protect assets from long-term care. Whoever wrote the prenup never explained that to a client. So I explained to this woman who's 60-some-odd years old, and the man who is in his 50s, that if his wife goes into a nursing home, they have no long-term care insurance, all his assets are at risk. And their response is, we did a prenup to protect against these things. There is a large age disparity. So I recommend highly that they go out and buy long-term care insurance. Yes, I.
So how do you sort of decide the ratio of what proportion of total assets would be in the disclaimer? How do you?
How do you decide what would go into the disclaimer? Typically, it would be up to $1 billion. The way the decision is made, you would, let's say you passed away, and your total estate was $1.6 million. You would put $600 in the disclaimer, and $1 million would go to your wife. Why? Because if your wife died the next day, there wouldn't be a penny of tax, state or federal. That's the formula you use. If the estate goes over $2 million, it's going to be $1 million in trust. But that's based on law as it exists today in 2013. Who knows what the law will be in 2016, 18, 20? The beauty with the disclaimer trust is you don't have to keep rewriting the document with different formulas, as long as you trust your spouse to make a good decision. I just had a woman die. She is the person who lived the longest known to Hopkins with Lou Gehrig's disease. Her husband's the most amazing man I've ever met in my life. I love this guy. I have so much admiration for this fellow, because he kept his wife alive for all these years. And so I go into this meeting, because I've known him, I've met with him many times, and I said, well, it's a shame, I guess, he said, no, she didn't die of Lou Gehrig's disease. She died of cancer. But the point I'm making here, they have no close heirs. It's all distant relatives. Now, in his case, he's not going to do the disclaimer. We're going to have it all go to him, and he said, I don't care about the tax issues. Because we're well under the federal level, and he said, whoever inherits, let him pay the state of Maryland tax. But at least he had the decision to make. Again, the other thing we can do, I've had any number of cases where we do pet trusts, where we leave money in trust for our pets, our birds, our dogs. You can do any kind of thing like that that you want, but it is subject to tax. If you leave money and your estate's over $1 million, you may have some tax because you're leaving money to pets and other family members. Once we get to this point, we have to think about a little flexibility in our document. So let me give you an example of flexibility. We leave money in trust for Nancy. Nancy's overseeing the trust. We give you something called a special power of appointment. So you can appoint it between your kids. So if you have a child that goes off the wrong path or has a problem, you can write them out. But then it has to go to either the other kids or the grandkids. It must stay in your family tree. But it lets you revise it. If one of your kids, I just had a case where actually a very good friend of mine developed multiple sclerosis in his, he's in his 40s. You will find it manifests itself usually between 35 and 50. Schizophrenia and a lot of these mental disorders manifest themselves with kids 16 to 30. So you may have a very normal person you're doing planning for. The client dies and their child or grandchild all of a sudden comes into one of these illnesses. Well, we can retrofit our document post-mortem after someone dies. Another thing we do in our document, Nancy has a document. Most people, if I said, Nancy, do you want the income from that trust that Jim left you? You're going to say, yeah, I want the income. But that's bad drafting. The way I write it is income to Nancy, income to George and Polly, your kids, or grandkids, priority to Nancy. So if you're 90 years old and in a nursing home, you can have the income run downhill to a child or grandchild. The key in estate planning is flexibility in an inflexible document. Because once you die, these documents get carved in stone. You can't make changes. So you've got to put some clauses in your document that allow you to make some changes. Called a special power of appointment. Income. Most of the old timers used to say, oh, income to my spouse. You know why? What's your first name?
Yeah.
Mirta. If we were leaving Mirta the money in trust, she's going to say, I want the income, right? But that's bad drafting. What if you don't need it? What if you're in a long-term care facility? It would just go down the tubes. So what's happening in America is people are living very long lifespans. And they're living in these care facilities in all kinds of situations much longer than ever. I mean, how many people would have lived 23 years with Lou Gehrig's disease? Today they are. You see O.J. Brigance. He's living for many years with this illness. He is really the pride of the Ravens. Unfortunately, I can tell you that Lou Gehrig's disease and derivations of that are developed with neck issues when you have that pounding. I've had clients with this problem. And it's not, by the way, they don't believe Lou Gehrig had Lou Gehrig's disease. He was beamed with a baseball the year before he developed the symptoms. Most people don't know that. I did some research into this for a client. And that's an interesting fact. Now let me segue out of estate planning into veterans benefits. 13% of all Americans are veterans, or possibly their spouses are veterans. Under the law, if you are a veteran or your spouse was a veteran, you are entitled to a benefit called aid and attendance. Aid and attendance says that you can get for your family somewhere between $1,100 a month for the spouse of the deceased veteran, all the way up to $2,100 a month. It helps keep people at home, defray costs of nursing home and assisted living care. There are 4 tests. Let's go through the 4 tests. 1, you had to be a veteran. You had to serve during wartime, Vietnam, World War II, Korea. You could have served in Germany or the United States. You did not have to be deployed. So that's test 1. Test 2, you have to be sick. You can't be well and say, hey, I was a vet, I'm going to just collect these benefits. But if you're trending downhill and you're sick, and your doctor will say that you're sick, you're eligible. And then we have 2 more tests. These are the hard tests. The next test is the asset test. If somebody was a veteran, Joe over here is a veteran. He served during Korea. And he has a house, a car, and $380,000. He will not qualify. He has too much money. He can have a house, he can have a car, but we have to get him below $80,000. The beautiful part about veterans benefits, aid and attendance, is there is no look-back period. We can move the assets to Ivor and Nancy and qualify for that test. So that's very important to understand that. Unlike Medicaid rules, there's no look-back period. And finally, there's the income test. Joe must show that his $3,000 a month of income are spent on long-term care. And let's say, your first name? Flo. Flo is the caregiving daughter. This happens all the time. We're laying out $1,000 a month for Joe over here. But he has too much income. He's $2,000 a month. What we do is we enter into an agreement with Flo called a care management agreement. And since Joe's living with you, Flo, we are going to pay you $2,000 a month for your caregiving regimen. Now you have to pick that up in income, but under veterans benefits rules, we can get you or your father or brother or whoever an extra $1,700 a month. It's called aid and attendance. If you lay out 100 people who'd be eligible today for that benefit, only 6 are collecting it. There are many cases, like the one I just gave you as an example, where people say there's nothing I can do. I'll give you a case that I had. Family comes in, they had $146,000. They were told by the lawyer, oh, you have too much money. Nobody ever told them, just move $60,000 or $70,000 and you qualify. Then they said, well, we really would like to put Charlie in a care facility, but we can't afford to because it costs $4,300 a month and he only has $3,000 a month coming in. I said, put him in the care facility, I will call them. I called them up and said, we will apply immediately for aid and attendance. You will be brought current when they get that check in. They'll get a check in about 6 months. That check will be for $1,700 a month. They actually had enough money there, but the cash flow was not sufficient for them to be comfortable putting him into assisted living. And we solved the problem. He had all the elements. He was sick. He was a World War II vet. His assets were a little high. We solved that very quickly. We moved him. Third test was the income test. They couldn't get over that hump. It was very simple. We called the assisted living facility. We said he has $3,000 a month coming in. They will sign an agreement that when that aid and attendance check comes in, they will bring you current. The assisted living facility said, fine. Now he's ensconced in a assisted living facility, $4,700 a month coming in. They're laying out $4,300 a month for his care. Very simple. But he didn't know it. It was there. It solves family problems. It also helps bring help into the home. So it's a tool that I use all the time for my clients. You got to know that's available. Very few people do. Yes, ma'am?
The case you're describing is somebody who will not get better, who may hold the line because of the period. It doesn't cover short term.
The young lady asked, she said, the case I was talking about was where somebody is not getting better. The question is, will aid and attendance be available for short term? My answer is, most short-term situations, we would consider aid and attendance because even though that person may not matriculate to a nursing home, they may need help in the home. If that is the case, we would probably encourage the family to look at aid and attendance. I don't say it's a solution in every case, but you got to look at it. It's one of a group of plans that you can utilize to get benefits for your family. I call it dialing for dollars. You want to find money to help with the long-term care. You want the best care possible. If you're like me, for my family, my mother-in-law just passed away, knock on whatever, she had long-term care insurance. Getting her to use it was like pulling 12 teeth. She kept saying, I'll wait for a longer time. I said, Mom, we want to keep you in your home as long as possible. But you want to pull the string and access these benefits as quickly as you can. The beauty in her case was we could have gotten 8 in attendance, but between her pension, Social Security, and long-term care insurance, she covered her costs on a day-to-day basis. But when her long-term care insurance would have run out, we would have gone after 8 in attendance. We were positioned for that scenario. In a lot of these cases, I try to explain to clients and even my young people that you're playing on 3 different tracks. One, you're looking at current 8 in attendance. Secondarily, you're looking, if you're not getting 8 in attendance, you're using whatever benefits with an eye toward accessing it. And then the third overlay is long-term care. What do I do when I finally run out of money? Or how do I correctly run out of money and still preserve money for Aunt Matilda? Let me explain to you the elder care rules. There's a 5-year look back. If you make a transfer for less than market value, that means if I sell Mirta, my house, for $100,000, it's worth $200,000, there's a transfer for less than market value. If I give my church, my synagogue, I give the ASPCA $10,000, that's a transfer for less than market value, subject to a penalty. The penalty is for every $6,800 I give to, first thing? Miguel. What? Miguel. Ah, Miguel. Same as mine. If I give Miguel $68,000, I have a 10-month penalty. 1 month for every $6,800. Let's do a plan. Let's assume, Miguel, that we have a good power of attorney that permits us to make gifts. And let's pretend that Charlie needs long-term care. And Charlie has $400,000. Under the Medicaid law as it exists today, you could spend all $400,000 on Charlie's cost of care. Well, if that was the case, you wouldn't even need to help you, just spend it. But we can start by retaining for Charlie up to $2,500, and that's protected. We will spend $12,500 in Charlie's burial. That's protected. So we have $15,000 protected. $385,000. Now we've got to figure out how to protect that, or a portion of that. What do we do? Well, our next step is to assess what's going on cost-wise, look at whether we have a power of attorney. And does that power of attorney allow for gifting? That's the most important power in the power of attorney for elder care purposes. So now we're going to consider making a gift. We're going to gift to you using the federal gift tax exemption, $385,000. Now don't go out and party. If we have multiple family members, sometimes we'll put it in trust. Now one of the dilemmas we have is we have to look at the income tax situation, because some people have these big IRAs that can really hurt us dramatically. But in this case, it's just a bank account. You now have $385,000. The question is, what do you do with it? Well, the first thing that we do is we look at the penalty. And the penalty is less than 60 months. We multiply 60 times 6,800, and you're going to find it's, let's just for argument's sake, say it's 56 months. Let's humor me, I'm just picking a number. So that means you would have to pay for Charlie's care for 56 months. Well, that doesn't sound like a great strategy because it wouldn't leave you much to hold for Charlie. But the way the law works, we call this strategy half-a-loaf strategy. You will begin returning to Charlie $6,800 a month. And you will do that every month till I tell you to stop. Because your penalty of 56 months on the, let's say you give $6,800 this month back to Charlie, goes to 55 months, then to 54. And there's a way to do this so that when we hit somewhere between month 28 and 32, that we can stop giving it back. There's a crossover point. And in a fact pattern traditionally like this, we will protect for a family member somewhere between $180,000 and $200,000. So remember what I tell you. You can make a gift even if Charlie's in a nursing home. Gift is made using the federal gift tax credit. If I hear one more person saying, well, I can only give away $10,000 a year, you're even wrong about that. It's 14. But you have this federal gift tax exemption that allows you to give away $5,250,000. So you don't have to worry about the gifting. What you have to worry about is the strategic way that you reimburse Charlie. See, if you paid it directly, even though you get a medical expense deduction on your return, you would not be shortening that penalty. So we want you monthly, and what I do with a lot of my clients, I do it in tranches of 6 months. Give back X, and then you stop, and the next 6 months give back, so that we calculate just correctly, and we protect that couple $100,000. How many of you would prefer to spend $385,000 in long-term care versus protecting $200,000? I don't see any hands. Now, I've been criticized over the years, how can you tell people to do this? Well, my answer is, how can I tell people how to pull money out of an IRA and avoid tax? I mean, it is strategic planning. You can choose to do it or not do it. Most people, given their own family, would choose to protect something. In this case, you're protecting some dollars, and the purpose of your protection, Miguel, is to make certain that Charlie has some money if you need to supplement his day-to-day needs. Not for you to have a good time and ride off into that great cruise around the world. Now, ultimately, that's a collateral benefit. Where the amazing gains can be made in elder care is when we have a community or healthy spouse. And we're going to marry off, I don't know if you're related, but we are, for this purpose, is Nancy and Jim. And of course, we're going to put Jim in the nursing home. So Jim goes into the nursing home. And typically, the way it usually works, somebody gets sick, they go in a hospital, then they go to a transitional care unit, then to rehab, then nursing home. For 90 days, and that's why I always take, usually the first 100 days may be covered by Medicare and your Medigap coverage. That's why we always look for a 90 or 100-day waiting period before your long-term care insurance kicks in. That's why you buy that way. You save some premium. Now what happens? Under the law, Nancy gets to keep the following assets. Now we know what Jim can keep. We can prepay his burial and $2,500. But Nancy gets to keep. And we're going to endow you with 2 cars as a family, a house worth $400,000, and $400,000 in assets. She gets to keep a house, a car, and actually 2 cars. So we're going to assign Jim's car over to you with the power of attorney in the house. They're all exempt. Nancy informs me she hates Jim's car, as my wife hates my car. But we will advise you to keep it till we get Jim on Medicaid, and then you can sell it and keep the proceeds. And the question I always get in these house cases is, I don't want to live in this big house. Jim's kept me here in a house that's too big for me. I say, keep it, Nancy, sell it, and buy a condo after the fact. Because once we get Jim on Medicaid, it's your money. In fact, we're going to change your will to leave everything to your kids and not back to Jim. It's one of the things you got to be careful of. Because sometimes a person will predecease the person in long-term care. What will we do? We have $400,000. Now, this is where we have fun. I call this the Jack Bailey Queen for a Day strategy. My mother loved that show. As a kid, I used to sit there and cry every day as they. But here's what happens. You get to keep the house and the cars. You will sell Jim's car when he's on long-term care, keep the proceeds. You will get to keep half the assets, but not more than approximately $110,000. So you get $110 less than $2,000. We're at about $288,000. We have to find what to do with that. So we protect it. And let me give you some things that we can do with the $288. We can fix up your house. Your washer, dryer, refrigerator, roof, anything that's needed in the house, you can do because you're putting it in a protected asset, the house. You can upgrade your cars, but I don't encourage that. That's a depreciating asset. But the house is worth fixing up, whether it's to be sold or whether it's for you to stay in. And we're going to spend, in this case, $28,000. So we're now down to fix it up. We're now down to $270,000. We're going to pay not only Jim's burial, but your burial, another $20,000. It's pretty conservative burial costs. And you say, well, what if we do cremation? Let's just prepay it. We're at $250,000. How do we protect $250,000? Well, the next thing is, I say you have a HELOC. Do you know what a HELOC is? It's home equity line of credit. Do you have any credit card debt? You advise me you got a $20,000 equity loan. We pay that off. Perfectly legal. Now we have $230,000. This is getting easy, isn't it? But if we're at an end point, there's nothing more we can do. But if you live in Maryland, and you want to hear, Maryland is one of the states where it's good to live in for elder care planning. If you happen to live in New Jersey, Florida, Delaware, Ohio, Texas, and a boatload of other states, you can't do this. But here in Maryland, we call Bill Lebo. And we'd say, Bill, we got $230,000. We're going to give it to you, not as a gift, but as an investment advisor. And you are going to buy for lovely Nancy an immediate annuity. And an immediate annuity is a tool that will return to you the $230,000 plus interest over 5 years. And under Maryland, and I want to highlight other states, you must look at this state by state. And this is going to be on our website. I don't want somebody from Delaware following this. You then can get the return on that money, and it turns it into income definitionally under Medicaid rules. And the only thing you pay income tax on is the earnings. But the assets disappear from our table, and we can get Jim on Medicaid. It takes about 90 days. Within 90 days, with a healthy spouse, a well-written power of attorney, and a good game plan, we have protected the house, 2 cars, and $400,000. The pioneer, the person who pushed this law into place, is our own senator at that time. I think she was a congresswoman, Barbara McCulley. Why? Because widows and women were being left threadbare with no homes. So she devised this methodology to protect the assets. I think it's good law. Many of our clients are worth sizable sums. They could be worth $500,000 to $1 million. But if you spend all your money on Jim's long-term care, you couldn't afford your home. So we can protect all these assets. Once we get Jim on Medicaid, we can sell the home, downsize, and you'll even have more money to live in. But this is the law. This is how it works. The secret to the implementation of this law, I can't make this powerful enough, is the power of attorney. By golly, if you have a pre-2010 power, you better get it updated, because you don't want to be thwarted in your ability to implement this plan if you have a long-term care situation. The best plan you can have is have some long-term care coverage. I own long-term care insurance. I'll tell you what my policy looks like. It's a 4-year coverage, $175 a day with an inflation factor in the policy. That's more important than the amount. You want that inflation factor. And I have a 100-day waiting period. If my wife could get it, this is what you have to be careful of. My wife had her knee replaced. She is not eligible for at least a year after the knee replacement. And we hope she can get it. If she could have gotten it, I would have gotten shared care, probably 3 years. Shared care means this. You and Jim are married. You each get 3 years of coverage. Jim goes in and gets sick. We use his full 3 years. We can then use your 3 years of coverage. The person I'm most worried about in long-term care is the first person who gets sick, because we have a healthy spouse who's got to live while someone else is sick. And it would allow you to keep somebody in the home. My goal is to stay at home as long as I can and have the best treatment possible. My goal isn't to be first one in the nursing home. And I think that's what most people would like. Well, long-term care is one of the elements that is very important. I'm a huge proponent of it. That's why I tell you that I own it. Because as much as I can do elder care planning and everything, the more dollars you have, remember dialing for dollars, to cover care, the better your family will be in the long run.